Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama. I am professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am going to talk about the module Urbanization and Women-Headed Households from Population, Urbanization and Poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about the very concept of woman-headed households, the reason behind the growth in current era, and the consequences of the same. This module will enable us to understand the difference between a household and a family. What do we mean by woman-headed households? What are the reasons behind a household being headed by a woman? What are the socio-economic conditions of woman-headed households? And what is the extent of poverty among woman-headed households in India? The developing economies are essentially characterized by mass poverty, and during the past decade, the process of globalization has given birth to several new terms such as feminization of labor force, feminization of poverty, and female face of poverty. It is being argued that the feminization of poverty is basically rooted in demographic trends, culture, and social patterns. The feminization of poverty therefore finds its explanations in unequal treatment of the woman in society as well as economy, the expansion of woman-headed households, and implementation of neoliberal policies. All these factors mutually interact with each other, leading to marginalization of women. It is being felt that in the process of globalization, the less endowed are little to gain, and as due to patriarchal systems, families invest less in the human capital of their female members, and they naturally stand to lose in this process. So it is quite evident that under neoliberal regimes, the female in general and female-headed households in particular are pushed deeper into the poverty traps. Chant has indicated that the females who head the households have greater constraints in obtaining resources and services in housing and agriculture. They have less access to land, credit, capital, and decent jobs. So, they are more likely to be poor. Recently, many studies have pointed out that the number of female-headed households is increasing worldwide. In the 70s, the phenomena of feminization of poverty caught special interest of the researchers when a study by Pierce pointed out that the fastest growing type of family structure is that of female-headed households. A combination of several social and economic reasons can be cited for this. However, before that, it is important here to discuss some conceptual issues. Let us first of all define household and a family. The household is considered to be basic unit in a society for social, economic, political, and socialization purposes. Sociologically, household is a co-residential socio-economic unit regardless of kinship ties, whereas family is a group membership in which is mainly based on affinal and consanguineal ties. Thus, the former are task-oriented residence units and the latter are conceived of as kinship groupings. The type and size of the households in most of the societies are influenced by kinship rules, demographic and socio-economic factors, levels of urbanization and industrialization. Therefore, to understand the social structure of a society, the prevailing type of household, and their relative socio-economic status is a very useful tool. Let us define woman-headed households. According to the Census of India, the head of the family or household is a person who is recognized as such by the household. She or he is generally the person who bears the chief responsibility for managing the affairs of the household and takes decision on behalf of the household. The head of household need not necessarily be the oldest male member or an earning member, but may be a female or a younger member of either sex. Therefore, if such responsibilities are undertaken by the females in the households, such households would then be termed as female-headed households. However, there may be several other definitions identifying a household as a female-headed household. It may be defined as the absence of the male head or the greater economic contribution by the female members. ILO Thesaurus defines the female-headed households as the households where either no adult male is present owing to divorce, separation, migration, non-marriage, or widowhood, or where men, although present, do not contribute to the household's income. Thus, the headship of the household is usually identified with the person who has the greater authority in the family or household. In a patriarchal society, under normal circumstances, a male is the head of the household. Therefore, the household being headed by the females may not be seen merely as empowerment of women, but the abnormality of circumstances. When households are headed by women, it is generally hypothesized that these households are more likely to be economically deprived and lack the proper emotional environment for psychological development in children. Let us discuss about the reasons of households being headed by women. The main reasons cited for a household being headed by a woman can be: number 1, death of the adult breadwinning male family member. Number 2, divorce or separation. Number 3, disabled, chronically sick, bedridden, drug addict, chronically, voluntarily or involuntarily unemployed male member of the family. And number 4, greater longevity of women than men. Apart from these, there can also be a few cases of economically independent women, women who choose to remain single, and even unmarried single mothers. But these are considered to be deviations from the normal path of living in a socially accepted family type. The basic idea behind enlisting these reasons is to show that the female headship of the family is not the normal situation. Therefore, it also may have abnormal social and political outcomes. Let us have a look on socio-economic conditions of woman-headed households. In developing countries, the majority of households that are headed by women have many economic and social problems. Woman-headed households are often faced with issues such as cultural discrimination, lack of access to job opportunities, low literacy, and lack of regular income. Socioeconomic factors of poverty directly and indirectly affects the cultural, social, and financial conditions of woman-headed households. These factors are discussed as follows. Number 1, the economic problems. Given the growth of households headed by women, one of the biggest social concerns is the highest poverty level within these households. There are many studies which have shown that the households headed by women without a partner have much lower income levels and are more likely to live in poverty compared to those headed by men. Actually, the women in these households are more disadvantaged in choice of work, wage level, employment benefits, and heavier domestic burdens, especially where they have lower educational attainments. Women also possess less or even no land compared to their male counterparts, and due to this lack of productive assets, these women suffer from a limited access to formal credit markets. Female heads of the households often face time and mobility constraints in the labor market due to domestic responsibilities, and as a result, choose informal, part-time, or low-paying jobs to reduce the opportunity costs for domestic obligations, especially childcare. Due to lack of education, women in developing countries are generally more disadvantaged in the labor market. They tend to have lower labor force participation rates, are more frequently employed in the informal sector, and work in lower occupational positions as compared to men. Thus, in developing countries, households headed by women without a partner, without significant welfare benefits, and lacks of economic opportunities are more disadvantaged and experience economic problems in form of difficulty in meeting the basic needs of children such as food, clothing, school fees, maintaining the previous standard of living. Let us discuss about the stress and health issues of female-headed households. The female-headed households are more likely to undergo stresses and strains which lead to health problems in these households. These stresses may be due to uncertainty of income sources, instability of employment, lesser attention to nutritional intakes, and social stigma, among other factors. The loss of emotional and financial security leads to mental imbalances, and a woman not attuned to cope the domestic and other duties finds it difficult to take care of several responsibilities simultaneously. A physical fatigue without any emotional support leads to several psychological problems in these households. Furthermore, female-headed households often lack support from both social networks and the state. Chant underlines that female heads may lack ties with ex-partners' relatives as well as within their own families and communities, which further undermine their opportunities to come out of poverty. The feminization of poverty. Feminization of poverty suggests disproportionate representation of women among the poor, and since the last 2 decades, this trend is deepening, and it is also being suggested that women's increasing share of poverty is linked with the rising incidence of female household headship. Women's risk of impoverishment is greater than that of men's, not because of male absence, but because of economic gap related to gender division that may contribute to their vulnerability. Even though there is a natural escape through this issue that men are equally vulnerable, and since women are also feminine in their coping strategies, therefore they are more likely to be poor. But one should understand that the attitudes are determined by the given social, cultural, and institutional setup. Losing a partner or living without a partner is more troublesome for the woman than men in a patriarchal society. As we have already discussed that in case of the female-headed households, social, cultural, psychological, and economic stresses are mutually reinforcing each other. All these factors lead to feminization of poverty. As women have less access to land, credits, capital, and jobs with good incomes, and because they are likely to have dependent children, they are disadvantaged and more vulnerable to poverty. Poverty data in Figure 1, disaggregated by sex of the head of the household, available for 41 countries or areas in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean, show that disparities in poverty for female and male-headed households are country-specific. In some countries or areas, female-headed households are more likely to be poor, while in others, male-headed households are more likely to be poor. From the figure, it seems that the poverty rates in sub-Saharan Africa are higher for male-headed households, while in Asia, we cannot find much of the differences in poverty rates of male-headed and female-headed households. Since we get data under different categories of female-headed households for different countries, we cannot simply compare them across countries. The data from Latin America and the Caribbean and the more developed regions show that the households of lone mothers with children have higher poverty rates than those of lone fathers with children. In the same regions, poverty rates are higher for women than for men when living in one-person households. The differences in poverty rates among different types of households can be observed from this figure. The figure clearly shows that in the normal households, for example, households with couples living together, the poverty rates for female-headed households are lower than the male-headed households. These households actually represent the case where headship of the household is determined by the contribution of the male or female members in total earnings of the family. In such households, since the females are earning more than the males, the poverty ratios are also lower. But if we look at the households with lone parents and one-member households, we can easily notice the poverty ratios are higher for females-headed households and the single females as compared to male-headed households and single males. This is more valid in case of the households of lone parents with children. In 16 of the 20 countries with available data in the region, the poverty rates for households of lone mothers with children are higher than they are for households of lone fathers with children by more than 5 percentage points. In the remaining 4 countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama, the poverty rates for the two types of households are similar. Woman-headed households and feminization of poverty in India. In case of India, the census data in Table 1 and Figure 3 shows that there are about 27 million female-headed households in the country. They constitute about 10.9% of the total households in the country. This proportion has increased from 10.4% in 2001 census. This proportion has increased more sharply in urban areas as compared to their rural counterparts. The table shows that the proportion of female-headed households has increased by 0.5 percentage points, and this increase has been 1 percentage point in the urban areas as compared to only 0.3 3 percentage points in rural areas. Further, in Figure 4, an examination of the poverty ratios according to the sex of the head of the household shows that the female-headed households are more likely to be poor in the urban areas, while in rural areas we can observe a lower poverty ratio among the female-headed households as compared to the male-headed households. This is due to the reason that in the rural areas, due to the cultural ties, such families are generally able to find some support by the family members and the society. The figure shows that the poverty among female-headed households in urban areas is not only higher than the male-headed households in urban areas, but it is also higher than the female-headed households in rural areas. However, a look at the distribution of these households by their marital status shows another dimension of the poverty among these households. Let us see Figure 5. The figure shows that among the female-headed households, the poverty ratios are higher in case of the households headed by widows and divorced and separated women, and these ratios are the least for the households headed by never married women. In urban areas, the poverty ratios in the households headed by currently married women and never married women is lower than other types of female-headed households in urban areas, as well as their own counterparts in rural areas. On the other hand, the poverty ratio among the households headed by widows in urban areas is 21.25%, followed by 20.59% for households headed by divorced and separated women. Another way to look at the poverty among female-headed households is to observe their housing conditions. Census 2011 has tried to look at the housing conditions by the sex of the households. This enables us to have an insight into the living conditions of the female-headed households in the country. For this purpose, let us see Table 2. The table shows that lower proportion of the female households have permanent houses, while their share in semi-permanent and temporary households is higher than the male-headed households. The census data also shows that the female-headed households have fewer household amenities as compared to the male-headed households and therefore have lower standard of living. Poor standard of living of the female-headed households actually finds its explanations in relatively lower access to productive assets. These households generally possess smaller size of land holdings, lower level of education, and poorer access to the quality jobs. These characteristics of the female-headed households can be seen from Figure 6 and Figure 7. Figure 6 shows that the ownership of land is lower for the female-headed households than the male-headed households, both in the rural and urban areas. In rural areas, where land is more important mean of earning livelihoods, as the rural societies are mainly the agrarian societies, the ownership of land is more important as compared to the urban areas. Ironically, in the rural areas, the ownership of land among the female-headed households is less than half the size of land owned by the male-headed households. On the other hand, in urban areas, which are dominated by non-agricultural occupations, education is more important productive asset, but we can see in Figure 7 that the level of education, which is measured here as years of schooling, is much less among the female-headed households as compared to the male-headed households, and more importantly, this gap is higher in urban areas. Thus, we have observed that the disparities in ownership of productive asset exist both in the rural as well as urban areas. And these are more pronounced in case of land in rural areas and education in urban areas. Thus, women have much lesser land where land is more important productive factor, and they have much lower level of education status where education is more important productive asset. These differences naturally depict the segregation in jobs in the labor market and its outcomes. Due to lower access to productive assets and also due to established cultural norms, the work participation of women-headed households is much lower than that of the male-headed households. The figure 8 shows that during the year 2011-12 in the rural areas, about 50% of the females heading the households were not working, while this ratio was hardly 8% for the males heading a household. It is also important to note here that out of the non-working households, the proportion of rentiers and remittance receivers is much lower for the female-headed households as compared to the male-headed households. In rural areas, this ratio was hardly 19.62% for the female-headed households as compared to 44.53% for the male-headed households. If we look at the urban areas in figure 9, although the pattern is similar to that observed in the rural areas, but we can notice that the share of non-working and the rentier's household is higher for both the male-headed and female-headed households as compared to their rural counterparts. Though the data does not put forth the definite reason for the same, but it is generally believed that the households who receive the remittances or belong to the rentier class usually shift their locations to urban areas. And these trends are stronger for the male-headed households, while the female-headed households in this category may prefer to live in the protected and secure environment of the rural areas. However, here the main issue of concern is that hardly 39% of the female-headed households in the urban areas are employed, and rest of them would be dependent upon others for meeting their needs. These factors largely affect the quality of employment for male as well as female-headed households. As we have already discussed, relatively lower proportion of the female-headed households enter into the labor market. More of them are employed in precarious jobs, and the average earnings are much lower for female workers belonging to female-headed households. We can see in figure 10 that a greater proportion of the women belonging to woman-headed households is employed in casual and unpaid activities in rural areas. 30.5% of the women belonging to female-headed households work as casual workers as compared to 24.26% for the males belonging to the male-headed households. Their participation in unpaid workers is higher, while in case of working owners, it is much lower than the male-headed households. In urban areas also, we can observe the similar trends. 17.2% of female female-headed households work as casual workers as compared to 13.52% for male-headed households. Similarly, about 33% of them are working owners as compared to about 41% for the latter. We can also notice that their share as employers is also half of the male-headed households. Though it seems that more of the female-headed households work as regular workers as compared to their male counterparts, but if we look at the difference in average earnings, this higher attainment appears to be worthless. We can see that in rural areas, among the hired workers, the average earnings of the female heads is merely rupees 654 in casual employment and rupees 1,888 in regular employment as compared to rupees 1,037 and rupees 3,426 respectively for male-headed households. In urban areas, in casual employment, the female-headed households are earning rupees 719 as compared to rupees 1,192 for the male-headed households. Even in regular employment, it is rupees 2,800 for the former, while rupees 3,900 for the latter. Let us come to the conclusion of this lecture. We have observed that with urbanization, the number of female-headed households is increasing in the developed as well as the developing world. However, a greater proportion of them lives in poverty as compared to the male-headed households. With data from India, it has been observed that the female-headed households have lower access to the productive assets such as education and land. As a result, their participation in labor market is also lower, and if employed, a greater proportion of them is found in precarious jobs with low wages. Due to all these reasons, it is but natural that the level of living of the female-headed households is lower than that of the male-headed households. In absence of any social support from the family, community, as well as the state, the things get worse. Therefore, it is suggested that the social protection programs should adequately take care of the specific problems of the female-headed households so that they can also lead a decent life. I hope you must have enjoyed this lecture. We will meet again with another interesting topic. Till then, have a nice time. Bye-bye.